You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion. This generation of teenagers think they will have a harder life than their parents. The think tank British Future say 83% of 18 to 24-year-olds say it will be harder for today's teenagers to buy a home than it was for their parents. Their report also found that 72% think it will be harder for today's teenagers to get a good job than it was for their parents, with only 7% thinking it will be easier. Joining me to discuss the challenges facing the next generation is Simon Ross, Chief Executive of Population Matters. Shelley Saggar is a student and co-founder of the Look Left platform for young left-wing students. And Toni Pearce is the Vice President of Further Education for the National Union of Students. Simon, if I begin with you, Chief Executive of Population Matters, just how hard is it going to be for the next generation?
I think it's going to get harder, and it's a tough thing to fix. We've got global industrialisation, so much greater competition for resources, and other countries not needing, what we produce so much anymore. We've got continuing population growth, both in the UK and abroad. In the UK, another 4 million people in the last 10 years, and we've got climate change. So these really big pressures and these long-term trends are going to make life a lot harder.
Toni Pearce, Vice President from the National Union of Students.
I think that what's really important here is that this isn't just that young people are saying that it will be harder for them, but all the statistics point to the direction that it actually will be. When you're not likely to be able to buy your first house until the age of 37, and with kind of higher record unemployment in young people than we've ever seen before, with 50% of young black men unemployed, for instance. I think this isn't just about young people feeling like it's harder for them. It genuinely is, and it will only get harder.
And Shelley Saggar from the Look Left platform.
Yeah, and I'd like to touch a bit more on what Toni said, which is that, our whole economy has changed away from manufacturing towards just being a purely consumer-based, importing rather than exporting platform. And it is much harder for us today in terms of jobs, in terms of competition for university places. All of these kind of fundamental things that we used to take for granted are just not available really anymore.
Jobs are kind of the forefront at the moment. Jobs are increasingly harder to get for especially the next generation of graduates who have just finished university. What kind of outcome can they expect?
Well, I think there isn't much of an outcome right now. It's definitely not secure. It's not assured for them at all. Whereas before you'd expect to be in a job within a year, 2 years after you graduate. Now, of everyone I know, certainly, no one is in full-time employment yet. Everyone is doing unpaid internships or volunteering work or part-time jobs in clothing shops.
Simon Ross, university used to be a rite of passage for most people. Is it still going to be for this next generation?
I think education and training is really important. Technology is advancing, things are getting more sophisticated. Education is something that the UK has traditionally been strong at, and it's one of our strengths, and we should really work at. I think one of the things that employers are doing increasingly are globalising. They're either moving work abroad or they're bringing in people to the UK on contracts to work, because that can be easier than training them up themselves. And I think we really need to turn that around in the UK and say, how can we make UK business employers really connect with UK education? So there is that route between from universities and colleges into employment.
Do you think they're disconnected at the moment?
I think they are to a large extent. I think sometimes students go for studies that perhaps aren't that relevant to education needs, to employment needs, and we've seen how that's changing. I also think employers find it quite easy to bring in people that have been trained abroad, and that's an easy thing for them to do, rather than go through the apprenticeships and sort of management training schemes that they've had in the past.
But why would they? Why would they go for a British teenager who hasn't had the training? Why wouldn't you bring in a student or someone else from another country?
I think that's in the short-term interests. I can see that. I think we need to improve the education in the UK so that they can find access people. But I think the government actually has to step in and say, no, you can't do that. We can't have this constant inflow of people, and at the same time leave the people in the UK, students in the UK, unemployed. I think we have to put the limits in place.
Toni Pearce from the National Union of Students. Would you recommend the next generation of prospective students to go to university?
I think what we have to be really clear about here is that actually less than 50% of the population of young people in this country actually go to university, and actually those people who do go to university still have better employment prospects than those people who don't, and a huge amount of focus goes on graduate unemployment, but actually when graduates are underemployed, they're taking jobs away from people who don't have degrees. They're taking jobs away in retail, in manufacturing, that young people, and in some instances even taking apprenticeships. And actually until we learn to deal with youth unemployment as a whole and not just looking at graduate employment, then we won't be able to crack this, because we need different levels of skills in this country, and one of the key things to be able to achieve that is that we have parity of esteem between further and higher education, between vocational and academic education, because actually not everybody wants to go to university, get a degree and go onto a graduate scheme, but actually they're kind of pushed into that path because it's seen as that's the only route to success, and that's absolutely not true.
But what about the ones that are being pushed into going to university? A lot of schools put a heavy pressure on students to apply to university, especially when you're coming up to the end of your education. When are you going to apply? When are you going to apply? That's all that students ever hear.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's all I ever heard when I was at college, and I made the decision not to go to university in the end. And actually that pressure is huge on young people, because I think what's really strange about this country is that we don't allow people to define success for themselves. We don't ask them what they think success looks like for them, and then support them in achieving that. What we do is say, this is what we think is what success means. You go to university and then you get a good job, and then in a few years you can expect to be earning £50,000 to £60,000. And then when people can't achieve that anymore, they're blamed for their own failure. And actually that's not, we're setting people up to fail by saying that those are the only routes to success.
Shelley, you're a student yourself at the moment. Did you feel that was the only way that you could go? Were you pushed into university?
Yeah, I think so. I completely agree with what Toni said. In so many schools, and actually in families a lot of the time, especially with parents who either didn't go to university or could have gone but didn't because they didn't have the opportunity or whatever, there is this huge emphasis that this is the only way you can get a classic good job in, whatever, a lawyer or a doctor. And these have always been seen as just these fantastic ideals that you should aim for, and actually they're not for everyone. It's exactly what Toni's saying. Not everyone needs to be doing that, not everyone wants to be doing that, and we should allow them to choose for themselves.
But the government would say it's the best way to get a better education, and employers would say, I only want someone that's gone through university because they've got the qualification and they can show they can work in these high pressured environments.
Yeah, but a lot of the time I don't think having a degree, especially as Simon was saying, in a subject that isn't really relevant to where you're going to be working, I don't think that's indicative of being a hard worker or anything. Actually, if you haven't been through the system is designed to get you a degree. It's not designed to really educate you fantastically. It's designed to give you a qualification at the end of the day. And that's
if you do
not
a
what
subject
we need.
like law, philosophy, history, that does give you a very good education, doesn't it?
It does give it does give you an education, yes, but a lot of the time people aren't going into these kinds of things. They're just going into what are actually vocational things that you don't really need a degree for.
What's wrong with that? What's wrong with getting a broader education first and then specialising? You don't have to do a vocational course, though, do you? It gives you a broader sense and a broader outlook on life.
No, I don't think you should just be going to university for the sake of going to university just so you get a degree. If you want to go to broaden your education, that is exactly what you should be doing. But unfortunately, the pressure is that if you have a degree, you will get a job, and that's not the case at all.
So for our next generation, would you like to see more focus on vocational courses or more focus on going to college and not going to university? How would you like the education to be run for the next generation?
Well, I think we need to look at the European model quite a little bit more. In Belgium, for example, there's a lot of emphasis, and in Germany actually, a lot of emphasis on going to vocational colleges or further education colleges rather than a traditional university, or even specialist institutions like to do with business and finance that give you a degree or a qualification, but that aren't just going for the sake of it. You are actually learning skills that you will be using in your job.
Simon Ross, would you agree with that?
I would. I think we don't really have the luxury of people just going to university for 3 years and doing something that's interesting but maybe not that relevant to what they're going, particularly because so many more people are going to university now than did 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. It used to be really a small proportion. Now it's much larger, and we can't afford that. And we particularly can't afford that because you've got enormous growing countries like China and India and Brazil who are educating their young people to do practical, useful things, and often educating them better than we are, even at school age. So we really need to up our game and get a bit more practical, I think, about things.
When businesses say they want obviously the most skilled people, should we now be focusing more on vocational courses and get away from the so-called rite of passage of going to university?
Yeah, and I think young people wouldn't be against that. People often want to start their careers early on. They want to get ahead and do well. We've heard about the issue about housing and getting on the housing ladder. People are going to want those things. So I think people will be open to doing courses that actually is connected a little bit more closely to some realistic career prospects.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion. Joining me in the studio is Simon Ross, Chief Executive of Population Matters. Shelley Saggar is a student and co-founder of the Look Left platform for young left-wing teenagers. And Toni Pearce is the Vice President of Further Education for the National Union of Students. Now, Simon just brought up the problem of young people getting onto the housing ladder, Shelley. How difficult is it going to be? We're seeing an increasing amount of people now renting because they just can't get that deposit.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the issue. There's become this kind of expectation that you won't ever own your own house, at least not till you're 30, 40 plus, which never was the case for our parents or even our grandparents' generation. And looking at that British Future Generation 2012 report, I think the interesting thing was that actually a lot of people, I think around 9%, were saying they don't ever expect to own their own home. Now, that is something completely unprecedented. It wasn't the case about 10 years ago, if you were to ask, teenagers then. And I mean, it's just, we need a lot of help, I think, from the government. I don't think they're doing enough for us. They're just kind of saying, well, get on with it. You have to make sacrifices in order to get on in this world. But that wasn't the case for the past two generations. So why do we have to bear the brunt of it now?
You say look to the European model for education. Why can't we look to the European model in terms of housing? A lot of people in Europe rent, they don't buy. It's only the English who seem to have this very big objective of when they're young, they own their own house. An Englishman's house is his castle. Yeah,
I don't think we need to emphasise the fact that you should own your own house, but it has been the case for so many generations past, 2 generations past, that's become the norm. That's the expectation. That's what young people want in their lives. They want their own house, they want their own car, etc., etc. These things, I don't think we are going to get them, and if we are, then we need a lot of help from the last generation, as in from the government. We don't need to just be demonised and told this isn't going to happen for you, you can't have it.
Simon Ross from Population Matters. Do you think we need to have a focus on renting rather than having your own house?
I think I agree with Shelley. It's not really a matter of owning or renting per se, but it is a matter of having good quality housing at affordable prices. In Britain, we've got the smallest houses in Europe, and a recent architects report said that really makes people unhappy not to have living space, and we've got less and less access to green spaces. So we really need to think about, are we happy just to have more and more people within a crowded country, or are we going to do something about major building programmes, which again create problems in terms of planning blight into green belts and so on.
But the government have got that plan in place. They've set up various schemes to encourage first-time buyers to buy and encourage housing associations and builders to build more houses. Surely that's going to be enough.
That's going to help a bit, but I doubt it'll be enough because there's 3 things happening at once. One is we're all living longer, really much longer. 2, the birth rate's gone up by 25% in the last 10 years in the UK. And we've got, despite all the problems we've got in Britain, we've got more and more people wanting to live here. Another 4 million people settling here in the last 10 years. So we have this growth and growth and growth in demand. And also people divorcing, people living alone, changes in the way people live. And we don't necessarily have all the housing stock to meet that. So it's a big challenge.
So build more houses or stop people having as many children?
I think we need to do a bit of both, really. Certainly build houses in the short term. In the long term, I think we have to promote smaller families because actually, we've got limited living room.
Toni Pearce, we should encourage people to have smaller families.
I think it's a bit of a bizarre thing to say, but and I wouldn't really agree that it's the place of anybody, let alone the state, to kind of tell people how many children they should have or whether they should stop having children. And the idea that...
But we have a huge housing crisis. Simon's saying this is the only way to solve, one of the only ways to solve it.
I absolutely disagree. I think, it's very easy actually to look at, we said, why don't we look at the European model of housing where people rent, but actually it's very easy to say that when we have proper systems of rent control and controlling a rental market in Europe and in the States. And actually those may be things that this government needs to look at. The idea that we have huge problems with unemployment, particularly in cities, and yet people can't afford to live in houses. We have houses sitting empty in cities because people can't afford to live there. Where I grew up in Cornwall, I never expect to be able to move back there and own my own home because of the number of people in kind of middle-aged, middle-class people who own second homes in Cornwall, and actually that is a huge problem. And why aren't we talking about stopping those people buying second homes
why should we stop people buying second homes?
Working class people having children. I think that if that's kind of the debate, then maybe we should be looking at the people who've got the extra money kind of paying a bit for what's happening.
Isn't that just the state interfering just the same?
I don't think it's kind of equivalent, stopping people having children to stopping people buying a second house. I think those
You're interfering with someone's right to buy another house if someone's got that money.
Your free right to buy another house is very different to your free right to have a child, I think.
Simon, do you think that this schemes that the government's got in place to encourage first-time buyers to buy, such as the First Buy scheme, where first-time buyers only have to put up 5% of their deposit, do you think that's enough?
I think if you're a first-time buyer, it's really hard, and I can see a case for helping them at that point get going. They've done that before, and what's happened is there's a housing crash because they do come every so often, although house prices are so high, and then they find out they've got negative equity, they lose the house, they lose all their equity quite often, and they're thrown out of their house. So there's very difficult situations, and one of the problems in the UK, and other countries too, is these enormous fluctuations in house prices and these boom busts, which really sort of wreck people's lives because they don't really have any defences against that.
Shelley, we've already discussed some of the main threats almost to the next generation. How do we make sure we don't lose them? If they anticipate all of these hurdles ahead of them, how do we encourage them to still continue, to still get an education, to still aspire to want to own a house?
Well, I think the key issue you already touched upon is education. From a very young age, we need to be telling them, this is the situation. It's a globalised environment and market, and we're not really preparing kids for that at the moment. I think we need to focus. If you look at Europe again, they're all of these kids know how to speak English, and we take that for granted. Do we know how to speak French or German or Spanish? Not really fantastically, no. I think we need to do a lot more emphasis on that, actually. And to say to kids, actually, you might have to be prepared to move. If there's nothing here for you, you need to move. And not to see that as such a kind of a threat almost, because right now it is seen as like, oh, well, I have to move. I have to give up my, right to live in this country. I don't think it should be seen as such a negative thing. It should be seen as an opportunity. But right now, it is more of a threat.
Simon, the report from British Future showed that 67% of this generation were broadly optimistic about their future, but they recognise their life is going to be harder. Do you think that the kind of solution for them is to move abroad?
Well, it might well be. I mean, everyone likes to think things are going to get better. We all like a bit of hope, but also they're being a little bit realistic about the problems. Yes, they might look at other countries which perhaps less densely populated or are growing. Perhaps some people are even going to work in China and work in India because they find more opportunities there. But of course, other countries are facing similar problems. Spain has even higher unemployment than we do. Increasingly, recessions are becoming global. But certainly Europe as a whole is facing a lot of problems, and maybe there are opportunities in other continents. And certainly that's something that British did in the past. If you look at the 30s, 20s, 30s, even 50s and 60s, they moved to other places for better prospects. And if they have to, that's a shame. But if they want to do that, good for them.
We've looked at some of the challenges already, including education and housing, but Population Matters actually show that there's even bigger problems facing the generation in 10 years' time when we're running out of resources. this is something that they're not really thinking about now, but it's definitely something that the government's got to think about for the next generation, isn't it?
The government really does, and the government is to some extent, although politicians are always a bit short term. But we were all very conscious of the drought earlier in the year, particularly in the southeast of England. Part of that is due to growing population pressure, not having enough water. And the other thing is energy. We're really pushing on things like fracking and nuclear and biofuels and wind farms, and none of them are very nice options. But because we need more and more energy, and because oil production's already falling in Scotland and in the Atlantic. I mean, this is a global issue, of course, because China is growing so fast, and other countries are following it, and they are going to quite rightly competing for the resources that there are in the world. So you are going to see resource prices rise and rise.
So we're going to be pricing out the next generation then?
Everything is going to get more expensive, and there's going to be more competition. So, yeah, they're going to be up against not just people in their own town or their own country, but across the world, competing for the resources that there are and dealing with climate change. So, yeah, it's going to get tougher. And there's no way of escaping that, and we have to be realistic about that. And I think we've had a very fortunate 100 years where Britain's been, to some extent, dominant in the world, or certainly been in the top 10 nations. And we've had huge supplies of oil and gas and other fossil fuels quite cheaply. And both of those things are going to come to an end. So we are moving into a different era.
And what is that era?
And that era is resource constrained. And there's things you can do about that. We can reduce waste. We can have green technologies. We can try and live less luxurious lifestyles, which obviously some people still have very nice lifestyles. But I think reducing population growth is going to be a big part of that from our point of view as well.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion. Joining me in the studio is Simon Ross, Chief Executive of Population Matters. Shelley Saggar is a student and co-founder of the Look Left platform for young left-wing teenagers. And Toni Pearce is the Vice President of Further Education for the National Union of Students. Toni, we're all going to have to change the way that we think about things now. We will no longer be able to pick up that plastic bag and not worry about the impact it's going to have on the environment. We're going to have to think about how much non-renewable energy resources we're using. Just how difficult is it going to be for the next generation to make these decisions?
I mean, I think like in the first instance, I would probably invest in something else to carry my groceries with. But I think that, in the long term, actually what we need, if we need to move to green technologies and renewables, and we need to move to what I absolutely agree will be a completely different era of living in the UK, what we need to do is educate people in not only how to live in that way, but to innovate and invent to live in that era. And actually that's not what we're doing at the moment. We're not investing in education in the way that kind of almost the rest of the world is. We are not only are we kind of asking people to pay more for their education than ever, but when there will inevitably be a huge black hole in the economy caused by the higher education funding system that's being introduced. And actually it's this generation that will then end up picking up the bill for that in 30 years' time. And so what we need is kind of long-term sustainable policies from governments that aren't just about winning elections but about safeguarding people's futures. And we also need huge investment in education to ensure that actually we've got a population that can withstand what kind of they've got facing them in the next 20 or 30 years.
You kind of alluded to the tuition fee rises, obviously. They're now at £9,000. No one, according to the government, saw that coming. They expected the minority to be charging £9,000. But surely that might be doing exactly what Shelley wants, is pushing people away from university and into vocational education.
Well, the most recent figures from UCAS show that actually that it hasn't had that impact, that actually the same number of people are going into education. That's really positive, and I think that is testament to the way in which the new system has been explained to people. Actually it's had a bigger impact on mature students than any other group, so that's obviously not what everybody was expecting, but is a huge achievement to ensure that we've still got people going to university despite what's happened. But actually one of the bigger problems with this is that once you start putting a price tag on people's education, you are absolutely reintroducing introducing a system where you go somewhere based on your ability to pay or your willingness to pay a certain amount, and not on your ability to study. And that goes not only for higher education but for further education, where the government are introducing tuition fees and loans for the first time. And when we are in such a kind of economic crisis and we are in the position we are in the world, actually the place we should be investing the most in is education, both vocational and academic, and universities and colleges.
Shelley, we've mentioned all the challenges facing the next generation, the resources, the education, the housing, but what is going to be better for the next education? What do you think is going to be better for them than it was for the current generation?
I think we do have a lot more opportunities. We just need to recognise what they are and not see them as such a pressure on us, but see them as a positive step that we can take. And already there are people, especially in education, looking to move, especially to the United States, where actually the tuition fees aren't that different anymore. It's 10,000 in a state university rather than 9,000 over here, and so that is a good thing. We should be looking at that. But I think what is going to happen to our generation is that, we've already said that 67% of us are more optimistic about our future. I think that is slightly naive. I think they shouldn't be so optimistic. There isn't that much guaranteed for us. There might be opportunities ahead, but right now it's very uncertain.
Simon Ross.
I think innovation is absolutely critical. If we want to move to a resource-efficient future, which we do, where we bring in things like internet, fibre optics, all these other developments, computer games that are very efficient, that do use fewer resources, that's the way we're going to have to go. We're going to have to move away from fossil fuels. We're going to have to move away from huge use of metals. And we're going to have to think about how to produce food efficiently without destroying the environment. So we're going to have to change the way we all live, and that really needs better technologies, better innovation, clever thinking. So investment in those sort of things is going to be absolutely critical for the future.
What do you think is going to be good for the next generation? As Shelley mentioned, we're going to have a lot of challenges. She's got a bleak outlook for the future of the next generation. There's got to be something good for them, surely.
I think it's going to be a really connected world, because the whole world will be at our sort of level in terms of technology and connectivity. I think that's going to be great. I think we're going to continue moving forward with technologies, with the internet, with mobile. All the information you'll ever need is going to be in your hand, and that's going to be a completely different world to what we had 50 or 100 years ago, and that's a great improvement as well.
And Toni?
I do think that whenever these studies come out, people are always kind of overly optimistic, I think, about their futures, or they overestimate their current happiness or whatever it is. But, I think we do live in a society now that is more tolerant than it was 20, 30 years ago, and is more kind of multicultural, and and actually I would rather live in that society and know that kind of men and women were earning the same wage than I would be able to kind of go back 30 years and live in a society where that wasn't the case. And I think actually we need to be really proud of those things, and really proud of what kind of the steps forward that we've made in this country in terms of equal opportunities and liberation. And hopefully those are things that will continue to be strong over the next 20 or 30 years, and not be damaged by kind of all the other threats that we've got facing us.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Thanks to all of my guests. Simon Ross, Chief Executive of Population Matters. Shelley Saggar is a student and co-founder of the Look Left platform for young left-wing teenagers. And Toni Pearce is the Vice President for Further Education for the National Union of Students.